So yeah, there's no way to sort of formally start this, is there? Hello, everybody. Welcome to Plaque Stage Pass, which is the accompanying series which we're doing for Plaque to the Future, where we go into a little bit more detail about the lives of the recipients that we focus on in the series. Last week we released episode 1, which you should know by now is all about Virginia Woolf. And so we're speaking today to Rosemary, who is a historian and all-round Virginia Woolf expert. So very well suited to the role, I would say. And we've also got Beth here, who is a young producer and who also provided the wonderful voice of Virginia Woolf in episode 1. I don't know if you guys would also like to introduce yourselves and do a better job than I did. If so, please do so now.
I think you did a pretty good job. But hello everyone, I'm Beth. I'm an actor, a writer, and also a young producer.
And I'm Rosemary. I'm a historian and a writer and a member of the English Heritage Blue Plaques panel, though I would not class myself as an absolute expert on Virginia Woolf. I am one of her greatest fans.
Well, that's good enough for me, Rosemary. So it better be good enough for everybody else as well. So just to kick things off, we just wanted to speak about obviously the way that we hear Virginia in episode 1 is with a very RP accent. Well, accent is obviously not a regional way of speaking. But what was her relationship with the media and sort of having to speak in that way? It was obviously very expected at the time that if you were appearing on radio or anything, that's how you would speak. And so the only audio recordings that we have of her are on the radio. So what can you sort of shed some light on that kind of culture and how that kind of mixed with her being an author and what was kind of expected?
I think that the recording we have of her, I think that's just how she spoke. I don't think she was doing anything particular for being on the radio, because certainly the media, in the sense that we use that term, wouldn't have meant anything to her or to any of her contemporaries. And you've just got to bear in mind that until radio came along, most people didn't know how anyone else spoke unless they actually knew them personally. So you get regional accents, you get accents within groups, classes, villages, counties. And it's only really right at the very, very early sound recordings. If you hear Tennyson, he had a Lincolnshire accent, and nobody thought there was anything funny about that. But as more people hear more people, then you get a sort of consensus around what was basically an upper middle class accent, which Virginia Woolf had anyway. But really, RP is a kind of post-war, post-Second World War thing. And then you get in the 50s that extraordinary thing with vowels, because consonants don't change, but vowels change all the time. And you get announcers who are not saying that hat, but that hat. And the Queen, if the early recordings of the Queen, she does that too. And that sounds just mad, but all you can be sure of is that your granddaughters will think you sound as comical as the Queen sounded in the 50s.
I mean, Beth, from your perspective and approaching RP, what was that? What was that kind of like? Because I know you'd sort of had a course in how to do it.
Yeah, I'd literally just done a course that the weekend before I recorded, just a free course, which was really, really helpful. But there is a difference between just, quite standard RP and the RP that Virginia Woolf would speak. She was quite heightened, so I had to basically relearn how to say certain words, because some of the sounds, those vowel sounds, were so different to the normal way of speaking. But it was really interesting, and it definitely helped me get more in character, learning how to make those little the little things she did with the words that she used. Obviously Virginia Woolf was around in the Victorian era, which is, I can imagine, very different to what it is now. But what would it have been like for her being a teenager in those times?
Well, I think that's really central to her life and indeed her influence, because of course growing up as a late Victorian, I mean, girls, obviously women didn't have the vote, they couldn't go to university. Most of the professions, well, all of the professions actually were closed to them. So even if you were growing up as she was in a household which was very intellectual, her father edited the Dictionary of National Biography. The family, by extended family, were related to Thackeray. It was a very literary, cultivated, clever household, but it was also very limited what you could do as a girl and what you could expect for your future as a girl. And that, I mean, she had a difficult childhood in lots of ways, not least because her mother died very suddenly when she was 13. So right on the brink, and she says somewhere, this extraordinary thing, I was like a little sort of chrysalis coming out, and then suddenly events sort of crushed her. And I think she felt that something in her was stopped in her teenage years by these external events. But really what she and her sister did by getting out of Kensington, moving to Bloomsbury, it was all very shocking at the time because they went as young women, single women, they were entertaining friends, their brothers' friends, they were doing it all unchaperoned, which was very revolutionary. And they, as they moved out of Kensington, Bloomsbury was not a smart part of London. They painted the walls white. They had big, instead of all that, you know, Victorian heavy mahogany furniture and flock wallpaper and so on, they really kind of exploded that Victorian and Edwardian world. And that was really where the whole idea of Bloomsbury and modernism came from. And it had a lot to do with sexual liberation and literary liberation, and what wasn't then yet called women's liberation.
Yeah, a progressive figure even now, I think, in some contexts, sort of the way that she thought about ideas and the way that then ended up on the page is still sort of pushing the boundaries of what culture is talking about now.
Yes, I mean, she had a very original mind, and that's quite rare to have an original mind. And although, of course, she wanted education for women and equality for women, she does say in that recording that we do have of her speaking on the radio, well, you know, we now, everyone can go to university and read English. Are we better writers than we were 300 years ago? I don't think so. So she's always trying to get at what it is that you want to be as a writer, and that is something more than just the education, just the right to vote. And she was, as I say, she was a remarkable one-off.
Yeah, I mean, it's really daunting putting her on a page and being like, how do I condense this woman that's basically got an entire universe of knowledge and human understanding into 10 minutes? And yeah, she's just a very enchanting character. And I kind of like, even there, I'm speaking about her in like the present tense because it still feels like sort of her ideas and everything are kind of they're still permeating like what we're doing here. Obviously,
she had a huge insight into human character, and that hasn't changed. Though of course she did famously say that human character changed with modernism, but she knows perfectly well that it didn't really. It's a way of speaking about this big shift of consciousness that happened at the beginning of the 20th century that she was very much part of. But in fact, she wrote incredibly well about 18th century figures, 19th century figures. She had great psychological insight. And so, yes, I mean, that's always going to be relevant. And also, if you read her diaries and her letters, I mean, she did have a lot of her life was in the best sense ordinary. You know, she was eating and drinking and going to the shops and smoking and visiting friends. And she writes about all that brilliantly and vividly, and no incident is too small for her to include it.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the Bloomsbury set just now. In terms of the kind of status that they had as a group, were other people in London and the UK kind of aware of that group as it was in existence, or was it sort of something that has sort of been I don't know, canonized with hindsight by sort of researchers? And
I think they were very well. There was Old Bloomsbury, which was the group that was just her, Virginia, and her sister Vanessa, and their brother Toby, and then his friends from Cambridge, which was how they knew these men, Ian Forster, Strachey, and so on. And Toby died very young, and that kind of cemented the group. And I don't think then anyone had really heard of them. But then there's a kind of second wave, by which time, yes, they were well known as a group of intellectuals who wrote a great deal, who were written about. I mean, it was only after their death that you get this sort of complete Bloomsbury industry, which has gone on and on and on, and is perhaps a bit much, you might think. But no, people were, by the 20s and 30s, yeah, I mean, at which point, of course, like most of these things, the people who were most centrally involved rather felt that it was over. But no, people were aware of them as a set, as a group.
Okay, and did being part of that group, I mean, obviously particularly for Virginia, but with anyone else as well, was being part of that group influential in the kind of writing that they then went on to produce? Is there any sort of evidence that
yes,
the ideas?
Absolutely there is. I mean, they had a thing also which was part of Bloomsbury, which is called the Memoir Club, and that was some of them. And they, so each would take it in turn, like a writing group. I mean, they would take it in turns to write something about their own life, particularly their childhood, and read it to the others. And actually, Virginia Woolf found it quite difficult and challenging, some of this. And of course, they were from the outside, they looked like a very tight set, but of course, like all writers in groups, were riven with jealousy and bitchiness and competition, and saying frightful things about each other behind one another's backs.
I think that leads on really well to the next question about Vita, because we hear about Vita, but we don't know, well, I didn't know very much about this, so I had to do a bit of research. But I think I'd really like to ask you about the comparison in fame between Vita and Virginia.
Well, I don't think, I mean, in their lifetimes, Virginia Woolf was much better known, because she's 10 years older than Vita. So, and she was well known as a writer. Vita was not so well known. She was known as a poet. She was admired as a poet. She won prizes as a poet, but she wasn't really on the same level of fame. And in fact, in some ways, I think her poetry hasn't really stood up particularly well, but she's much more famous now as a gardener. And her garden at Sissinghurst that she created, which now belongs to the National Trust, she was a very innovative gardener, rather in the way that Virginia was, and the Bloomsburys were innovative writers. She did away with a lot of very formal ideas about planting. So she had very formal plans, but wonderful informal planting. And the White Garden at Sissinghurst, you know, you have to kind of, in normal times anyway, have to kind of book months in advance to go and see that. So as a garden designer, she's very much remembered. As a poet, not so much.
Where we leave the episode is sort of in the middle of an exchange of letters between Vita and Virginia, and Virginia's just sort of formulating Orlando. But can you tell us more about how their kind of relationship developed kind of after the 20s and up to Virginia's death, how that kind of changed? And
well, really, it sort of came to an end. I mean, although, I mean, we're very lucky that they were in love with each other because they both wrote wonderful letters. But neither of them was this really the love of their life. So there was this incredibly intense emotional relationship. But Vita, but it sort of, it cooled, it passed after about 10 years. And what Virginia Woolf did in Orlando, which is extraordinary. I mean, that's really Vita Sackville-West's afterlife, is Orlando, which is the most wonderful novel. But I think, yes, all one can say is it was an incredibly passionate attachment on both sides for a while, which passed.
I read an anecdote somewhere that after Orlando was released and sort of a copy of it was sent to Vita, that she kind of addressed it to her new lover. Is that true? Because if so, that's...
I don't know if it's true, but it's perfectly possible, because by the time that Orlando appeared, the kind of peak of their affair was over. It was sort of 6 years into it, and the real love of Vita's life was Violet Trefusis, who was had been a friend since childhood, and they had a really very stormy, intense, decades-long relationship. And other people came and went, including, of course, Vita's husband, who was also gay, and they had obviously, for very obvious reasons, the marriage was difficult for some time, but then they actually came to a very good accommodation, and they were very, very companionable.
I can imagine it was really difficult being gay in those times.
But it was always much easier, and arguably it still is, for women, because lesbianism was never criminalized. You couldn't be arrested. You could get into a lot of social hot water, but you were not breaking the law. Whereas obviously for men, it was much, much more difficult and more dangerous.
It was challenging, obviously, to be gay, especially for men in those times, but for women it was difficult because they were repressed. So Virginia Woolf was quite a feminist, which I'm all for. So I'd quite like to ask about what was feminism like in the 1920s? And what was the poignancy of Orlando?
Well, feminism, which wasn't really as such a thing in the 20s, was in an interesting situation, because what it had been about, what it really concentrated on, for obvious reasons, in the later 19th century, was getting the vote. It was all focused on votes for women. And by the time the 20s came along, the vote, I mean, it wasn't, 1919 didn't enfranchise women on the same basis as men, but the kind of process had started, and I think most people realized it was pretty much inevitable, was going to happen. So then you were thinking, well, what else? What about the universities? You could go, I mean, Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own is based on 2 lectures she gave at Cambridge to women's colleges. But although you could go as a woman, you still couldn't take a degree. Women were not admitted to degrees at Cambridge till after the Second World War. This was all very slow progress. And Virginia Woolf wanted women to have access to the professions. And she was offered honorary degrees by both Manchester and Liverpool, and she turned them down, as she turned down the offer of Companion of Honour, because she said, no, it's a corrupt society, and I don't want anything from it. She wasn't going to take something for herself because she was famous, which was denied to other women through their own efforts. So yes, I mean, she was and it's still okay, yes, as she was the first to admit, she had privileges, she had money, she had family, but it was still quite brave to take those stands, and she did, and she never wavered.
She couldn't help what she was born into.
No.
But it's what you do with that afterwards.
Well, exactly. And also she does say all the time in A Room of One's Own, where she says, you know, what you need if you want to be a writer as a woman is money and a room of your own. And she talks about how she has this money, because she has a private income, she opens her purse and there's the money, but she doesn't take it for granted. And part of her argument about, she has this, if you've read it, but imagines what might have happened if Shakespeare had had a sister who was as talented as he was, but she wouldn't have been able to earn a living. She wouldn't have been able to organize people and tell them what to do. So Shakespeare's sister is desolate and dies, and is buried in Virginia Woolf's imagination at the Elephant and Castle. And I live quite near the Elephant and Castle, and every time I go around it, I think of Shakespeare's sister, who might have ended up there. So she's very aware and very explicit about her advantages as an individual and her disadvantages as a woman.
I think that's, you know, you're still seeing people now, not just from a feminist perspective, but, you know, from many different perspectives, having to take that kind of stand in refusing honours and things, because that seems to be a way that the system seems to think it can deal with disparities. I mean, you would know this being part of the panel, obviously, but it seems to me that, like, when you're looking at why Virginia got a blue plaque in the end, it was because of sort of the groundbreaking work that's kind of epitomized with Orlando, and also the importance of the Hogarth Press and sort of how I don't know, just it was a very straightforward way of dealing with a problem that they were facing in terms of what they were allowed to publish and sort of wanting to get the message out there. So I suppose, are you able to shed some light on the setup of the Hogarth Press and the detail behind the motivations that they had to set that up, and the climate in which they were publishing?
Yes, I mean, printing in those days was, of course, a much more manual, physical thing, and typesetting and so on. So, I mean, again, we think of it as self-publishing. I mean, this is something that's coming back very much with different media. But yes, they wanted to do, there were a lot of precedents in that area. Don't forget, you know, William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, and a lot of, Morris was communist. There was a lot of radical press which relied on private presses. It wasn't, I mean, I don't think one should think of it as a kind of underground samizdat outfit. It most certainly wasn't that. But on the other hand, it was publishing, well, they published Freud, eventually they published themselves, but that wasn't the first impetus. And of course, as still happens now with small presses, they found, I mean, they published T.S. Eliot when no one else would, but when Faber and Faber made him a good offer, he went to Faber's, and Virginia Woolf was furious, as you would be, that you bring a writer on and then they slightly do better elsewhere. And indeed, the relationship between Virginia Woolf and Eliot was always a bit testy. So yes, I think that there was that sense, which again, we tend to think is a very modern sense, that if you wanted to publish and nobody else was really doing what you wanted, well, just do it yourself.
Yeah.
You did need money, but you didn't need to be fabulously rich.
Yeah, it was just as a kind of enterprising spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
It seems like she enjoyed challenges and trying to find her own way to conquer that.
Yes, I mean, I wonder if, I don't know that she exactly enjoyed challenges. I think that she felt that she could do, I mean, like many artists in all media, that she could only really do what she could do. And sometimes from the outside, that would have appeared daring or bold, but she couldn't really, she had to do it her way.
I think that's what made her so interesting to kind of try and write, in that she's sort of this massive figure of British culture, and yet because you're aware of how progressive her views were and how enterprising she was, and her standpoints on a lot of things, it kind of felt like you could have a bit of fun with her, because like her capability to think so diversely is really apparent, and that's not always well documented with people. But the way she dealt with things, obviously the way she dealt with some things didn't work out great for her, but ultimately, yeah, her perspective on life and the world, it was kind of, it was fun to like shuffle around and make it fit a silly little story. Beth, I think you should ask the last question, which is the fun one. 'Cause, yeah.
Okay. So, Rosemary, if you could be on a call with Virginia Woolf today, what would you ask her, or what would you tell her?
I wouldn't dream of telling her anything, because for all that we've said about how we admire her, and also because she was very humorous. I mean, if you read her diaries or her letters, they're very funny often, but often at other people's expense. She could be very crushing and very sharp. So I don't think I'd think about telling her anything. I think what I'd want to ask her is really, which I would not know her answer to. I think if you asked her what she thought about the Bloomsbury industry, I think we know what she'd say. But if we asked her, what do you think about what's happened to women's rights? Where do you think women have got to? Where should women be going next? That I think I would be very interested to hear about.
Oh man, I really want to ask her now.
Well, do you think she'd be satisfied?
No, never satisfied. And I think in a way, although she was of course concerned about women's rights, she was more broadly interested in what it is that the female principle, that's a big thing in Orlando. What is it that femaleness is within culture, within humanity? What does it contribute? How does it work? So I think she would have been endlessly curious, and she would certainly, given that there is plenty, I mean, there's enormous violence still against women. We know all the dark side of it. So no, I don't think she'd have been satisfied, but I think I would like very much to know what she'd say.
That brings us to a close. If I'm going to be a professional presenter, brings us to a close. So thank you, Rosemary, for your insight and excellent fangirl nature for Virginia Woolf. Put us to shame. And obviously Beth also for understanding her voice in a way that is creative and accurate and just, yeah, great. So thank you to both of you, and please watch the next episode of Black to the Future when it comes out next week.
Definitely.
Thank you.